She never believed love could be dangerous, until the night a billionaire with secrets in his eyes walked straight into her perfectly guarded life. Behind every gift he gave was a truth waiting to break her heart, and behind every smile she hid was a fear she could no longer control. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like, and comment if you believe some love stories are written in fire. The first thing Clara Bennett noticed about the ballroom was how perfect it was. Every light shimmered exactly where it should, every violin note rose at the right time, every smile looked rehearsed. Perfection, beautiful, exhausting perfection. The bride and groom were twirling in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by people who looked like they'd been born knowing how to waltz. Crystal chandeliers spilled light like champagne. Laughter rang through the air, the soft, gilded kind that money and social standing often polished over the years. Clara stood at the edge of the room, champagne flute in hand, the silver of her dress glinting faintly with every turn of her wrist. She smiled when people looked because it was what was expected of her. She smiled even when she didn't feel like it. Her best friend Layla, the bride, had begged her to just relax and have fun. But fun wasn't easy when you were surrounded by reminders of everything you'd decided not to want. Wealth, power, control. Clara's eyes lingered on the men in tailored suits and polished shoes, confident, charming, all so sure of themselves. She knew their kind too well. And that was when he walked in. Alexander Hawthorne didn't enter a room. He commanded it. The moment he stepped through the tall glass doors, the atmosphere shifted, as if the air had rearranged itself to make space for him. Conversations paused. Heads turned. He was tall, at least 6'2", in a black tuxedo that looked like it had been stitched to his frame. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw sharp, his posture deliberate. Everything about him radiated ease and authority, the kind that wasn't taught but inherited from years of being obeyed. He wasn't supposed to look her way, but he did. And when his gaze found hers across the sea of silk and sequins, Clara's chest tightened. It wasn't attraction that startled her. It was recognition. Not of his face but of the type of man he represented. The kind who could by silence, command devotion and walk away unscathed. The kind her father had been. She turned her head quickly, pretending to sip her champagne, her heartbeat fluttering against her ribs. "Are you really hiding at your best friend's wedding?" a familiar voice teased. Clara glanced up to see Layla's cousin Emma, grinning. "I'm not hiding," Clara said, trying to sound casual. "Just observing." Emma smirked. "Observing? Or judging?" Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe a little of both. Come on. It's a party. Have some fun. Dance, drink, fall in love for a night." "Love?" Clara chuckled. "Not on the menu." Emma laughed and drifted off to the dance floor. Clara exhaled, looking away, straight into the man from across the room. Alexander Hawthorne stood at the bar now, one hand in his pocket, the other swirling a glass of bourbon. The bartender was saying something, but Alex's eyes, piercing blue and unflinchingly direct, were on her. And then, as if fate enjoyed mischief, someone bumped Clara's elbow. Champagne spilled forward, straight onto his sleeve. "Oh God," Clara's voice caught. She grabbed a napkin from the counter and hurried forward. "I'm so sorry. I wasn't looking." "It's all right," he said, his voice low, calm, but undeniably confident. "I was hoping for an excuse to meet you anyway." Clara froze. "Excuse me?" A small, knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. "You've been avoiding looking at me for the last 15 minutes. "I have not," she said, defensive, cheeks warming. "Then I suppose it was my imagination," he said easily, holding her gaze. "Alexander Hawthorne." She blinked. The name landed like a small earthquake. Even she knew who he was, the billionaire tech investor whose company had recently bought 2 major firms in the city. He was the kind of man who appeared in business magazines beside words like visionary and unstoppable. "Clara Bennett," she replied coolly, shaking his hand for exactly 1 second before letting go. "Pleasure," he said. "Friend of the bride or groom?" "Bride," she said. "And you?" "Business with the groom. He's been pitching me some new project. I almost didn't come." "Then maybe you should have followed your instincts." His brow lifted. "Is that your polite way of saying I don't belong here?" "It's my way of saying this isn't your usual boardroom." That made him laugh, a low, smooth sound that wrapped around her like velvet. Touché. She wasn't sure why that small victory felt like electricity under her skin. A moment of silence passed, not awkward but heavy with something she couldn't name. "Would you like a new drink?" he asked. "I'm fine." "Something stronger, perhaps?" "No, thank you." "Then maybe a dance?" Clara hesitated, glancing toward the dance floor, where couples swayed beneath the glittering chandelier. I don't dance with strangers. Then it's fortunate, he said, stepping a fraction closer, that I'm trying not to stay a stranger. Her throat tightened. You're persistent. He smiled faintly. I've been accused of worse. And just like that, she found herself walking toward the dance floor with him. The orchestra shifted to a slower song, a soft piano and cello arrangement that seemed to hum in rhythm with her heartbeat. Alex placed his hand lightly at her waist, his touch warm but steady, not demanding. She placed her hand against his shoulder, the scent of his cologne, cedar, smoke, and something faintly citrus, dizzying her senses. They began to move. At first, she resisted, trying to keep emotional distance even as their bodies aligned. But he moved with precision, guiding her effortlessly. Still think I should have stayed home? He murmured. I haven't decided yet. You will. I doubt that. His smile deepened. You'll find I rarely lose arguments. Then maybe you haven't met someone who fights back. His laughter was genuine, surprised and impressed. You might be right about that. For a moment their eyes locked. The air between them shifted, from playful to something quieter, heavier. She looked away first. When the song ended, she stepped back quickly. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Hawthorne. Alexander, he corrected softly. Right. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening. Clara, he said, stopping her retreat. Do you always run when something feels real? Her breath caught. I don't know you well enough to answer that. Maybe that's the point. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned, walked away, and didn't look back until she was at the edge of the ballroom. He was still watching her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through her apartment window, bouncing off the half-drunk glass of water beside her bed. She hadn't been able to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Blue. His eyes, his smile, the way he'd said her name like it meant something. She told herself it was nothing. Just a dance. Just a stranger. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. You left before I could say goodnight. Clara stared at the screen, heart skipping a beat. She should delete it. Ignore it. But she didn't. Instead, she typed 3 words that would change everything. Good night, Mr. Hawthorne. And somewhere across the city, in a penthouse high above the skyline, Alexander Hawthorne smiled as he read her reply, the beginning of a game he already intended to win. The text had come 2 days ago, and Clara still wasn't sure why she hadn't blocked his number. She told herself it was curiosity, or maybe politeness. Anything but interest. But when her phone lit up again that morning with, Good morning, Clara. I hope your coffee's as strong as your first impression. She caught herself smiling before she could stop it. Smiling at a man she barely knew. A man who probably owned half the skyline. Don't be ridiculous, she muttered, setting her phone down. It was Saturday, and the city outside was painted in soft February gray. She had planned to spend the weekend grading essays and avoiding any form of romance, digital or otherwise. But fate apparently had other plans. At exactly 11:30 the doorbell rang. Clara frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a man in a crisp black uniform stood there beside a massive bouquet, white peonies, blush roses, and orchids so perfect they looked unreal. Delivery for Miss Bennett, the man said with a polite smile. Oh, I think you have the wrong. There's a card, he interrupted gently, handing her an ivory envelope. Clara took it hesitantly and opened it. For the woman who makes silver look like starlight. Alexander. Her heart sank and fluttered at the same time. She wanted to be angry, or at least unimpressed. But the flowers were breathtaking, and her apartment suddenly smelled like spring after a storm. She placed them on the kitchen counter, shaking her head. What are you doing, Clara? You don't fall for charm wrapped in luxury. And yet, that evening when she finally texted him back, you shouldn't have. He replied instantly. I know. But I wanted to. Over the next week, Alexander's presence began to thread its way into her quiet routine. When she stopped by her favorite cafe for her morning latte, the barista handed her a cup already waiting. It's covered, he said, nodding toward a note taped to the lid. For the woman who takes her coffee like her boundaries, strong. She laughed despite herself, tucking the note into her purse. Later that week, when she was leaving the library after work, she found a sleek black car idling at the curb. The window rolled down. Need a ride? Alexander. He looked almost too good for the setting, in a charcoal coat, white shirt unbuttoned just enough to look careless but deliberate. His expression was calm, but his eyes had that spark again, the one that made it hard to look away. I can take the subway, she said, clutching her tote bag. You could, he replied. Or you could take a ride with me and let me pretend I'm doing something chivalrous. She hesitated. Every sensible voice in her head told her no. But something else, something softer, whispered just this once. All right, she said finally. The car door clicked open. Inside, the leather smelled faintly of cedar and mint, the same scent she'd caught on him that night at the wedding. The city lights flickered across his face as they drove, gold, red, violet. Do you always send flowers to women you barely know? She asked. Only when they seem determined not to be known. She turned to him. And what makes you think I'm one of them? He smiled slightly. Because you have that look, the one people get when they've learned that love isn't safe. His words hit too close. For a second she forgot how to breathe. Maybe I just don't like attention, she said quietly. He glanced at her, his tone softening. Then I'll try to give you the kind that doesn't feel like pressure. For a man whose name opened boardrooms and shut deals, he said it with disarming sincerity. The car rolled to a stop outside her apartment building. Thank you for the ride, she said. Thank you for saying yes, he replied, eyes steady. It's rarer than you think. She opened the door, but before she stepped out he said, Clara? Yes. I'm not trying to buy your attention. I'm trying to earn it. The door closed softly behind her and she stood on the sidewalk, heart pounding, watching the taillights fade into the night. By the end of the month, their paths seemed to cross more often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes like fate was conspiring. One evening, while walking through the art district, she found him in a small gallery, leaning against a column, staring at a painting of a stormy ocean. I thought you didn't like surprises, he said without looking up. I don't, she replied. But this one's tolerable. He turned, smiling. You have good taste in art. I have good taste in peace and quiet, she said dryly. He laughed, then walked over. Peace and quiet are overrated. Spoken like a man who's never had to fight for either. That shut him up for a moment. He studied her, not as a man studying beauty, but as someone seeing something fragile and dangerous in equal measure. Tell me something, he said. What is it you're afraid I'll turn out to be? She met his eyes. The kind of man who thinks affection is a currency. The silence that followed was sharp, cutting. Finally he nodded slowly. Someone hurt you into thinking that? Her chest tightened. Maybe. But that's none of your business. He didn't push. Instead he walked toward the counter, paid for both their coffees and handed her one. Then let's just start with coffee, he said softly. No business. No expectations. She hesitated, then took it. That night, when they parted, she realized she hadn't smiled that much in months. The following morning her mailbox held a single envelope, cream-colored, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. For every wall you build, I'll plant something beautiful against it. And beneath it a single pressed rose. Clara traced her fingers along the stem, torn between laughter and disbelief. He wasn't just persistent. He was patient, dangerously so. Still, for the first time in a long while, her apartment didn't feel quite so empty. She placed the rose between the pages of her journal and whispered to herself, roses don't bloom in winter. But deep down she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. Clara had always believed that love, if it came at all, would come softly, through shared books, unhurried laughter, and coffee gone cold from too much talking. Not through rooftop dinners, private jets, and men who made the world bend for them. But Alexander Hawthorne didn't do soft. He did spectacular. And he did it for her. It began subtly, a lunch invitation at a quiet restaurant she'd never been to before. The place was glass and marble, hidden away above the city like a secret. I thought you'd appreciate a view that doesn't come with too many people, he'd said when she arrived. It wasn't crowded. In fact, it wasn't open to the public at all. She realized too late that he'd booked the entire rooftop for them alone. Clara had tried to protest, but the wind had caught her hair, the skyline had glittered beneath them, and for a moment she forgot to be cautious. They ate slowly, the conversation surprisingly easy. He spoke about his childhood, growing up in a small town before fortune had found him. He told her about the night he'd slept in his office because he'd fired half his board for betraying his trust. She told him about her students, about the joy and exhaustion of teaching teenagers who were smarter than they knew. He listened, not the way powerful men pretend to, but fully, with his eyes steady on hers. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. Having all this? He smiled faintly. Money? Yes. Power. Attention. He leaned back. Every day I don't find someone who wants me without it. She said nothing, but the honesty in his tone pulled something loose in her chest. When they finished, he didn't ask to see her again. He just said, "Next time you choose the place." And for reasons she didn't understand, that made it harder to breathe. Next time came sooner than she expected. That weekend, Clara took him to a small, independent bookstore downtown, her sanctuary. The owner, Mrs. Porter, looked up, startled to see her with someone. "New face," she said, smiling. "And a handsome one." Clara rolled her eyes. "Behave." Alexander chuckled, walking through the narrow aisles with reverent silence. "It smells like paper and time," he murmured. "You come here often?" "Whenever I need to remember who I am," she said. He turned to her, his expression softening. "And who is that?" "A woman who still believes words can fix things that people break." He studied her for a long moment, as if memorizing that sentence. Later, when they left, he didn't buy any books. But the next morning, a courier delivered a box to her door. Inside were 10 first editions, classics she'd once mentioned loving, each inscribed, "For Clara who still believes." Her fingers trembled as she lifted one. The ink smelled new, but the sentiment felt ancient, like something whispered instead of written. She sat for a long time staring at them, caught between awe and guilt. Was this what being cared for by a man like him felt like? Beautiful, but heavy? Over the next few weeks, their worlds began to overlap in quiet, deliberate ways. When she stayed late at school, his car would be parked outside, waiting, not to intrude but to make sure she got home safely. When her lecture hall projector broke, a brand new one appeared 2 days later, donated anonymously. And when she came down with a mild flu, he somehow found out and sent her an entire basket of remedies, and soup from her favorite cafe. It wasn't just the gifts, it was how he noticed everything. One evening they walked through Central Park, cold air misting between them. The trees were bare, their branches stretching against a pale winter sky. "You make it difficult to keep my distance," she said quietly. "Maybe you shouldn't try so hard," he replied, hands in his coat pockets. She stopped walking. "You don't understand, Alexander. I grew up in a house full of expensive silence. My father was powerful, generous, and completely unreachable. Everything I needed came in boxes, not in words. And I swore I'd never let myself live in that kind of cold again." He looked at her, something raw flickering behind his eyes. "Clara, I'm not your father." "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes you sound like him, certain, untouchable." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "If I'm untouchable, it's only because I've never found a reason not to be. Until now." The world seemed to go quiet. The distant hum of the city faded. And for the first time, she didn't pull away when he brushed his fingers against hers. The contact was barely there, a whisper of warmth, but it felt like the start of something irreversible. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, replaying his words. She didn't want to fall for him. She didn't want to believe that a man like Alexander Hawthorne could understand what it meant to be truly seen. Not as a prize, not as a project, but as a person. And yet, every gesture, every look, every word he'd spoken had begun to melt something inside her she thought was frozen for good. She didn't notice the envelope under her door until morning. No name. No signature. Just a folded piece of thick paper. Inside was a single line. "Tonight, 8 p.m. Dress warm." She hesitated, then smiled despite herself. By 8, a black car waited outside. The driver handed her a note, "Follow the lights." They drove through the city until the skyscrapers faded into open space. When the car finally stopped, Clara stepped out into the crisp night air, and gasped. They were at a winter fairground, closed for the season. Except for one section, glowing softly with string lights and the distant hum of a carousel. Alexander stood near the Ferris wheel, hands in his coat pockets, waiting. "You rented a fairground?" she asked, half laughing, half incredulous. "I promised I'd make the kind of memories you couldn't buy," he said simply. For a moment she forgot how to speak. He offered his hand. "Come on. Let me show you the view." They rode the Ferris wheel slowly, the city lights stretching out in the distance like scattered gold. The wind tugged at her hair and his shoulder brushed hers. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have anyone." He looked at her, unflinching. "Because you look at me like I'm human. Not headlines, not bank accounts, just a man trying to be better than he was yesterday." Her throat tightened. "That's not fair," she whispered. "You're making it hard not to care." "Good," he said softly. "Because I already do." The Ferris wheel crested, the world below frozen in light. She looked at him, really looked, and realized that for the first time in years she wasn't thinking about what she feared. She was thinking about what she could lose. When the ride ended, they stood in silence, neither ready to leave. The air between them buzzed with something fragile and warm. Then he said quietly, "Clara, whatever you think I am, whatever you're afraid of, I'll spend as long as it takes to prove you wrong." And somehow she believed him. At least for tonight. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for the world to test everything Alexander and Clara had built. 3 weeks since the Ferris wheel. 3 weeks since she'd started to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could look different this time. And then came the headline. Hawthorne Acquisitions faces ethics scandal. Investors question billionaire's intentions. Clara's heart sank when she saw it splashed across the morning news. The story was everywhere. Talk shows, gossip sites, podcasts. A whistleblower claimed Alexander's firm had manipulated contracts, forcing smaller companies into silence. There were pictures of him leaving meetings surrounded by lawyers, face unreadable. She knew better than to believe everything written online, but fear didn't care about reason. Fear remembered her father's empire collapsing under a similar storm. The shouting. The betrayal. The silence at the dinner table that lasted for months afterward. Clara stared at the news feed until her coffee went cold. Then her phone buzzed. "Alexander, I need to see you." She typed, "Now's not a good time," but didn't send it. Because even as the walls rose inside her, another part of her whispered, "What if he needs you?" He arrived at her apartment that evening. The world outside was draped in gray rain, his car headlights slicing through the mist. When she opened the door, he looked exhausted, still immaculate, but the tension around his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights. "Clara," he said softly. "Is it true?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear herself. He exhaled, stepping inside. "Parts of it. Not the way they're saying." "So there is something." "There's always something," he admitted. "When you build something big enough, someone will always want to tear it down. But I haven't lied to you." She crossed her arms. "You also haven't told me much. You disappear for days, you show up with gifts, and you act like everything's fine. I don't even know what's real anymore." He closed the distance between them, his tone low but firm. "This is real, Clara. Me. The way I feel when I'm with you, that's the only part I'm sure of right now. Then why does it feel like I'm standing on the edge of someone else's storm?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering. "Because I'm trying to protect you from it." "I don't need protection," she snapped. "I need honesty." The silence between them grew sharp. Finally, he said quietly, "I thought giving you peace meant keeping my chaos to myself." Her chest tightened. "And I thought you understood that I can't love a man who lives behind walls." They stood there, two people trying to reach across a distance built by fear and pride. "Tell me the truth," she said finally. "All of it." He hesitated, then nodded. They talked for hours. About the business deal, the partners who betrayed him, the lawsuit that wasn't about corruption but control. About how every success he'd built had made him lonelier, not freer. "I've spent my whole life proving I'm more than my father's son," he said quietly. "But maybe I've just become him in a better suit." Clara's eyes softened. "No. You're trying to be better. That's what makes you different." He looked up, eyes searching hers. "Then why do I still feel like I'm losing you?" "Because I don't know if I can survive watching another man I care about drown in ambition." "Then let me show you I won't," he said, voice rough. "Don't walk away from me now, Clara. Not when I finally have something worth fighting for." Her heart cracked at the desperation in his tone, but the ghosts in her mind were louder. She took a step back. "I need time." He nodded once, slowly. "I'll give you that. But I'm not giving up." And then he was gone. Days passed. The rain didn't stop. Clara buried herself in work, pretending she didn't check her phone every hour. Pretending she didn't replay every word he'd said. But at night, she dreamt of him, of the Ferris wheel, the way he'd said her name like it was both a promise and a plea. Then one morning the news changed. A full interview aired, Alexander, calm and poised, detailing every truth he'd shared with her that night. The recordings he'd kept, the evidence that proved his integrity. He'd refused to hide, refused to let his lawyers speak for him. He'd faced it all and won. And at the end of the broadcast, when the reporter asked what had driven him to speak out publicly, he said, "Someone once told me walls don't protect you, they bury you. I'm done being buried." Clara froze. Because those were her words. That evening she found herself standing outside his penthouse, heart pounding, rainwater clinging to her coat. When he opened the door, surprise flashed across his face, quickly replaced by something softer. "I saw the interview," she said. He gave a faint smile. "I guess I owe my best quotes to you. You didn't have to do that." "I did. For me. For us, if there's still in us." She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "I was scared. Not of you, of what loving you might turn me into." He reached out, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "And what's that?" "Vulnerable. Clara," he said softly, "vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the only way any of this means something." Her eyes filled, and before she could stop herself she whispered, "Then maybe I'm ready to mean something again." He exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. When he drew her into his arms, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows storms when everything finally makes sense. "I'm still afraid," she murmured against his chest. "Good," he said. "So am I." They both laughed, softly, the kind of laugh that sounds like relief. Later, as dawn broke over the city, Clara stood by the window watching light touch the skyline. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You know," he said, "I used to think love was about control. Building things so strong they couldn't fall apart. And now," she asked. He kissed her temple. "Now I think it's about building things that can, and choosing to rebuild them anyway." She turned, smiling through tears. "You've learned something after all, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Only because I had the best teacher." Outside, the city stirred awake, endless, imperfect, alive. And in that quiet morning light, two people who had learned to fear love finally learned how to stay.